Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about communal politics and the partition of India. In the earlier lecture on the same theme, we talked about the political developments of the 1930s, that how during that particular period, especially the 1937 elections where Muslim League could not secure many seats and it was very disappointed, and the background of the rise of the Muslim League from 1906 onwards, the kind of policies which were followed by the British with regard to the divide and rule, where it in a way supported the Muslim League against the Congress, and it wanted to in a way divide the Indians on different kind of lines, whether the religion, region, caste, etc. And British, they promoted every kind of a division, their surveys, their census, etc. They were trying to create fixed kind of identities among the individuals, and they wanted to choose only choose them wanted to choose that these people, they choose some kind of a one identity for themselves, though they might be having multiple identities. So it was being done in a very systematic kind of a manner, where they could in a way divide Indians on various kinds of lines. And we find that how Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, became disillusioned with the politics of the Congress in 1920s and thereafter, and over a period of time he was not in a way connected to the Congress. And how Jinnah and Iqbal, they were also collaborating with each other, and the ideas of Iqbal, they were taken in a kind of a spirit by Jinnah. And when they both of them, they were collaborating, they also realized that how country was to be redistributed at that point of time, and the communal politics of that particular period, where Iqbal and Jinnah, both of them, they were trying to demand some kind of a separate space for the Muslims at that point of time. And we find in the various kinds of utterances which were made by them at different places, they made their intentions clear. And in 1940, especially in the Lahore session of the Muslim League, the demand for Pakistan was raised as well. And we have seen that various scholars, those who have tried to study these kinds of developments, they have also argued that how Jinnah also over a period of time realized from his own perspective, and he also declared and demanded that such kind of a redistribution, if it does not happen, then the civil war kind of a situation would arrive. And he also suggested that this kind of civil war in any case was going on in the form of the communal riots which are happening. And he wrote a letter in June 1937, and he made a distinction between the Muslims who were in majority in northwest in Bengal and those who were in minority elsewhere. So we find that Jinnah's shift over a period of time in his strategy, when it became more obvious when he was speaking at Lucknow in 1937, and he said that the policy of Congress would result in the class bitterness and civil war. And we find that Gandhi in a way felt that this amounted to a declaration of war as well. And we find that when Iqbal passed away in 1938, and Jinnah, had he been alive, Jinnah acknowledged the poet's impact on the Pakistan resolution of 1940, and he would have been happy to know that we did exactly what he wanted us to do. So this is what Jinnah talked with regard to Iqbal, that what he wanted was being done, and this has been argued by Hector Boletho, who has pointed out this kind of an aspect. And we also see that other scholars like Datta, they have argued that it was Iqbal who, as an intellectual godfather, inaugurated the two nation theory, besides offering a map of redistribution of territory. It was Iqbal who blazed a trail that Jinnah followed. Iqbal conceived an idea of Pakistan, Jinnah realized it. So V. N. Datta has been in a way more forthright in his argument, that how Iqbal acted as some kind of an intellectual godfather to Jinnah, and he was talking about this two nation theory, and how this territory was to be redistributed was also talked by him it was also communicated by him, and Jinnah was just a follower of Iqbal who tried to put in practice the kind of ideas which were shared by Iqbal with him. And we find that when you talk about these kinds of ideas, then the communal propaganda was also full of fervor at that point of time, fear, contempt, and the bitter hatred which at that point of time has been argued by W.C. Smith. And when you talk about it in the framework of the activities of the League, the activities of the Congress, or the way Gandhi also felt with regard to those kinds of developments which were happening at that point of time, then we realize that when Jinnah and other League leaders, when they were talking about the aims of the Congress, then they were talking about that Congress aim was not the independence of India, but Congress wanted some kind of Hindu Raj which would in a way enable them to fulfill their basic motive. And that motive was seen by the Muslim League and Jinnah as the domination of the Muslims and the extermination of their faith. So Jinnah was successful in that sense, where he was able to create that kind of a fear among the Muslims, that this is what Congress was vying for at that point of time. And we realize that such kind of a fear mongering among the Muslim population also led to the rise in the number of seats which were secured by the Muslim League in the elections of the 1945-46. And we find that when it was being talked about that Hindu Raj would be there, and this kind of a fear was generated in the Muslim psyche, then it became easier to drive home the need for a separate homeland where Muslims could live and practice their faith in freedom. So we in a way realized that Jinnah was in a way successful in talking about these kinds of aspects. And when you talk about Pakistan or the idea of Pakistan or the demand for Pakistan, then it in a way flowed from the politics of fear and hatred which was adopted by Muslim League after 1937. And when you talk about the Lahore session, then the Lahore resolution which demanded a sovereign state for the Muslims on ground that Hindus and Muslims were two nations. So that was being discussed in the Lahore session of the Muslim League in the 1940, and it was also being seen that how British, the way they in a way promoted the Muslim League even in the late 30s and the 40s, where we find that how British, they felt that how they have to divide the Indian nationalism, and communalism was one of the weapons in their armory, in that sense, to divide the people of both religious communities. And we find that how when the Second World War broke out, then the Muslim League was assiduously fostered by Lilithgow, who was the viceroy, and the demand of Pakistan was used to counter the demand of Congress that British should promise that India would be free after war, and as proof of their sincerity transfer actual control of the government to the Indians immediately. So we realized that how British, they in a way talked about that how Hindus and Muslims, they have to come to an agreement on how power was to be transferred before process could begin. So when you talk about the resolution of Pakistan in that sense of March 1940, and so this kind of an idea which was being talked about in 1940, it was there since 1937, and the urgency of Lahore in the framework of the League's meeting was triggered by the outbreak of the war and the decision of the Congress to resign from the ministries. And Jinnah made up his mind, and we find that it was also celebrated as some kind of a deliverance day by the Muslim League when the Congress ministries, they resigned. And we find that whatever ideas Iqbal had, they found an exceptional constitutionalist and lawyer in Jinnah, and who very cleverly interpreted Hinduism and Islam as social codes which defined man's relation with his neighbor, and these two religions being thereby essentially exclusive in nature, he claimed, and they precluded any merger of identity and unity of thought. So Jinnah himself believed that how these two kinds of codes of Hindus and Muslims, they cannot come together, and the kind of remedy it lay in a constitution that recognized two nations in India, and these two nations, both of which must share the governance of their common motherland. So Hector Bolitho has argued in that particular framework, but what Jinnah over a period of time did with regard to the politics which were happening at that point of time, that he was demanding a separate state and a separate constitution for Pakistan. And this kind of a session, the Lahore session, it proved momentous for a public declaration of party's intent to seek a separate nation, as Muslim League did, by inventing a logic of perpetual existence of two nations in India, that how Hindus and Muslims, they could not live together. And we find that the word Pakistan was not used, but such a kind of a demand was inbuilt and inherent in the resolution itself, as has been argued by B.R. Nanda. And when you talk about that how Jinnah in a way was trying to negotiate at that point of time, and in his speech very systematically he laid down the reasons for a separate homeland, which was envisioning fearful situations when British left India without deciding on partition. So Jinnah was trying to create that kind of a situation, how he was trying to put the kind of imagination that if Hindus and Muslims, they did not get their separate homeland, and British, if they left, then the situation would be totally uncontrollable, and any kind of a constituent assembly so formed without the British around and with Muslims in a minority of one of Hindus three, he pressed panic button, and it would lead to the perpetual Hindu domination which was led by the Congress. So this is what we find, that he talked about these kinds of arguments, and he in a way talked or conveyed that Muslims had been ill-treated and oppressed in Congress-ruled provinces. So many kinds of ideas, they were being talked about by Jinnah, how Congress was being accused by Jinnah of mistreating Muslims in the Congress-ruled provinces. And he also saw that when he talked about his audience, and he told them that ever since the outbreak of the war, he had risen in the eyes of the Viceroy, and which had put Congress in a state of the worst shock. This is what he talked about, and he always in a way communicated during that time that how Muslims are a nation according to any definition of a nation, and they must have their own homelands, their territory, and their state. And he said that we wish to live in peace and harmony with our neighbors as a free and independent people. So his two-nation theory was unfolded in that particular manner, and he talked about Muslims as a separate nation by applying any kind of a definition. And he talked about that their territory and homelands and their state was to be in a way created, and then they wanted to live with others in peace and harmony. And Fazlul Haq, who was the Premier of Bengal, he moved the resolution for the idea of Pakistan, or the creation of Pakistan, and it stated that the basic principle of any constitutional plan ought to be demarcation of geographically contiguous units into regions. And we find that how it was constituted with the necessary territorial readjustment, so that areas with the Muslim majority, such as in the northwest and in east, should be grouped to constitute independent states in which constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign. So such kind of demands which were being made at that point of time, they were harping on the creation of a separate homeland for themselves, and we find that when such kind of things they were being talked about in, and they were being declared in that sense, and many a times the masses also listened to them, and they also were being mobilized by the Muslim League, and they many a times found some kind of a reason in them, because that was also one of the motives of the Muslim League and the motives of the colonial rule as well. The British, they also wanted that such kind of divisions they persist in the Indian society, and we find that when the newspapers they reported the next day, they were being seen as some, they reported it as a Pakistan resolution. That in a speech later, we find that Jinnah also claimed that no power on the earth could prevent Pakistan. So we find that Jinnah in a way found his own reason for the creation of a separate state, and how ideas of Iqbal in a way motivated him for his action. And when you talk about other scholars, those who have talked, those who have in a way negotiated, those who have talked about the politics of that particular period, and B.R. Nanda, for example, has talked about Gandhi's ideas, that how two nation idea as untruth, and Azad, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad talked about that resolution as meaningless and absurd. And Nehru communicated that all old problems had paled into insignificance before this new resolution, which had left no scope for the settlement or negotiations. So we find that different leaders, they had their own ideas or views with regard to the Pakistan resolution, and especially all of them, those who were there with the Congress, Nehru, Gandhi and Azad, all of them, they were critical of this resolution which was passed by the Muslim League. And we find that when Churchill, he became the British PM, and then a new scheme by Lilithgow, who was the Viceroy, was announced for India, and it was largely based on Churchill's suggestions, which was the August Declaration which was made. And so in this August Declaration, we find that how the status was declared to be, the dominion status was declared to be some kind of a goal, and the declaration also underlined a veto by minorities on any future constitution as well. And August Declaration talked about that power could not be transferred to a government whose authority was directly denied by large and powerful elements in India's national life. So such kind of ideas, such kind of statements which were there in such kind of declarations, then we find that they would not be feasible in that sense, because Nanda has argued that the League called it clear assurance that no future constitution would be adopted without their approval and consent. And Gandhi gave a call for individual satyagraha in October 1940. And we find that Muslim League had this kind of fear that this individual satyagraha might put pressure on the government, and want any concession to the Congress, with Jinnah reminding that the British government that Pakistan is now our sacred creed and article of faith. So we find that how Muslim League was in a way talking about this idea of Pakistan, and we also in this kind of a situation see that how League was recognized as the representative voice of the Muslims, even though its performance in the last elections hardly substantiated this kind of a claim, and promised that no political settlement would be made unless it was acceptable to the League. So this was a blatant power of blanket power of veto, which Jinnah was to use to good effect after the war had ended. And we find that when you talk about the other political developments apart from the August Declaration, we find that Cripps mission also came to India with the Stafford Cripps, and Labour Party leader with the friendly links with many of the Indian leaders, and how he added a mission to India whose declared intention was the earliest possible realization of self-government in India. So we find that after the August Declaration, another political mission, it came in the framework of the CRIPS mission, and as you can see on the screen as well, and the intention was talked about with regard to the realization of the self-government in India. But none of these kinds of proposals they were trying, or in a way trying to give in a very transparent manner the self-government to the Indians, and though they proclaimed something else, but their real intentions were totally different, because when you see the provisions, then they find that they were not up to the mark, and dominion status and not the full independence was promised, and that too after the war as well, and the people of the princely states were to be represented in proposed constituent assembly by the nominees of the princes. So we find that it also became clear that British would retain the control of the defence in the new executive council, and Congress did not accept it, according to the Secretary of State Emery, and a conservative reactionary, and it was a limited offer. And we find that when you talk about the CRIPS proposals, and then in a way, above all, it brought in Pakistan through the back door via the local option clause, and provinces, they were being given right to sign individual agreements with Britain about their future status should they choose to reject new constitution that would be framed. So we find that CRIPS mission also failed, and but at the same time it provided some kind of fillip to the activities of the Muslim League and provided legitimacy to Pakistan's demand by accommodating it in their provision for the provincial autonomy. So we find that when British, they realized that how such kind of demand of Pakistan was being made by the Muslim League, then they were trying to promote such kind of a demand, because they realized when that both Hindus and Muslims, they will be divided, then only they will be able to achieve their objectives of continuing their rule in India. So we find that when such kind of demand was being made, many of the Indians, they also did not take it seriously, and the kind of sympathetic consideration which was being shown by the officials what a great service to the cause of Pakistan. And we also see at a later time, when you have Shimla Conference and the elections, and at the end of the World War II, at the initiative of Viceroy Wivell, Congress leaders, they were released from jail in mid-June 1945, and they were being invited to Shimla to work out an interim political arrangement under which Indians would be responsible for running the country. So this was also being done after 1945, in 45 and thereafter, that in the Shimla Conference it was being talked about, and how League and the Congress, both of them, at that point of time, Congress was willing to cooperate and gave in its list of nominees as well, but Jinnah decided to test power of veto, which was being given to him by the British, and he insisted that the League alone had the right to nominate Muslims to the Executive Council. And we find that this was embarrassing for the government, as this denied representation to the Muslims of the Unionist Party of Punjab, which had supported British staunchly throughout the war. So that was the kind of a situation which was unfolding at that point of time. And but when you see the political scenario of that particular period, that how British they were trying to see that particular situation, and how they were also ready in that sense, that if not only partition but also balkanization also happens of India. So they were also carrying on with this kind of policy which they were following earlier as well with regard to the divide and rule. So we will talk about further about the communal politics as well as the partition of India in our next lecture. Thank you very much.